afternoon. Thank you all for coming here this great afternoon to spend some time with us and with our distinguished speaker coming all the way from the University of Oklahoma to us here. Professor Mohammad Al-Masri is a Congo Phillips Assistant Professor of Arabic Linguistics with a joint appointment in the Department of International and Area Studies and also the Department of Modern Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at Oklahoma. He's also director of the Arabic flagship program there, and he has received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Kansas, did his undergraduate work at the Yarmouk University in Jordan. He has also taught English as a second language and courses on phonetics, linguistics while in Jordan, and also taught Arabic as a second language at the University of Kansas, the Akhawain Arabic summer program in Morocco, and also at the Hashemite University in Jordan, where he used to be the department chair. Professor Masri's research focuses primarily on acoustic behavior of emphasis in Arabic and on lexical access, and also on applications of this research on the teaching of Arabic as a second language in the US. He will be speaking to us today on innovation and best practices in second language education, and primarily about this obsession, I hope, at some point with testing and whether this is fruitful or not, and where can we go from there, both in terms of the teacher and also the student. So I'm really happy today to see many of our students attending, as well as our faculty, and we're all ears to Professor Mohammad. Thank you for joining us and coming all the way from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Hanadi, and thank you everybody for coming, this evening when actually the weather is so wonderful outside. So I'm not sure we're making the best bargain by being in class. So well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at UVA. So what I will do today is actually try to maybe present some ideas, things that we have been using in second language learning. And I appreciate the presence of students, but I was going to speak on their behalf. I was going to say, students now I cannot do any of this anymore. Okay, so this project, I'm going to go through this. This is actually not my own work by myself. There is lots of collective efforts, primarily actful people working on different parts of a larger project. And especially this professor at Indiana, Eileen Glissan, had so much contribution to this work, which is actually much of it is underway. The main idea or the main idea of the presentation is what we call core practices of language learning, second language learning. All right. We have identified 6. Not me, several people have done this. And I'm going to go through them, and actually every one of them can take maybe 2 days of discussion if we want to. But what I will do, just try to touch on the most important things, and of course leave room for discussion and maybe trying to elaborate on these things. So the core practices are, as I said, 6 major practices in language education. They apply to any language. But of course, you can't tailor anyone to specific languages. The main idea behind this is that these practices cannot be self-learned. We cannot rely only on experience, which is definitely invaluable, but to acquire them. These are the products of so much research in linguistics, applied linguistics, and also second language education. All right, the first one, I'll just go through this. Very short introduction. So the first one is this. The first one is core practice number 1, to use the target language as a content and vehicle of instruction. So the idea, I'll take the freedom of the bias to Arabic, and I'll just imagine that our target language is Arabic. So this means that in a language class teaching Arabic, the professor and the students will use Arabic language, the target language, for both, for the content that they want to learn and also for the vehicle, the instructions that they give to students, the communication. So everything is done in the language, in the target language. And this principle says, you start from the beginning with zero proficiency on the part of the learner. Of course, this seems to be almost insane. How are you going to use only Arabic in a class where students don't know anything of Arabic? What do you do? How are you going to stick to this? The golden rule here is no less than 90% communication. By the way, up until maybe 3-4 years ago, everybody who was very, very hopeful talked about 75%. If you use 75% in the target language and 25 in English, let's say the first language, you're okay, you're good, you're doing a very good job. Actually, this says, go with 100%, but remain within 90%. How is this going to be possible? One fact that helps is that usually we are very sympathetic interlocutors in any language, whether in our own languages or when there are communication between people of two different languages. We proximate. I notice this probably everyone, when I speak to native speakers of English, they tend to slow down. No matter how good I try to be or I believe I am, they slow down and then they enunciate and they lengthen their vowels and they speak. This is being sympathetic. They're being sympathetic. Now, this is a universal principle. Everybody does that. So we try to use this, manipulate this rule in our language learning. We're sympathetic interlocutors. This is a very important rule. Think 1 plus I plus 1. I is that level. I is a student. So if you want to do this now, you need to design materials for students to learn, right? I cannot begin with the first level, freshman level, first year Arabic, giving them complex text. I'm going to give them texts that are actually comprehensible. So what do? We need to always think about our target, that is that learning outcome plus 1 level. So if I want them to, by the end of the year, let's say by the end of year 1, I want them to get to, I'm going to use actual terminology, intermediate law maybe, right? So the design of the material should be 1 level above. The reason is this. The reason is that there's what we call ceiling effect in assessment, right? If you set your goals at intermediate law and teaching material at intermediate law, that's your ceiling. That is how much anybody can reach. Now, not all the students are going to reach that for whatever reasons. Not so important in this aspect. So what you do is that you go 1 level above, and then now your ceiling is higher than the actual objectives that you have. You will see that students, some of them exceed the objectives, some of them fall below. Those who fall below are likely to fall within your logical goals. That is the idea. So when you set the learning materials, when you put your plans, when you want to do anything, you always plan more sophisticated, more challenging than the actual goals. Okay? You need to find what we call zone proximal development. So how are students learning? You come to terms with this. This kind goes back to the idea of sympathetic interlocutors. And important thing is rethink translation. This is one of the caveats. If you're going to use only Arabic, I've seen this several times. People immediately resort to translation because they're trying to be sympathetic. They want to make the life of students easier, so they translate. Okay, they say something in Arabic and then they translate in English back and forth. This is very serious. If you're trying to adopt this methodology, just avoid translation. All right, we'll talk about the problem with this. So the idea is that, what do? Students know very little to nothing, maybe in the beginning, and you want to create meaning. So the idea is that you work with whatever tools you have, whatever little knowledge they have, you manipulate this through whatever games, puzzles, tasks, anything. Okay, you just try to work with the little content that they know, but using different methodologies, different approaches. Okay. Okay. I'm not going to, because if I want to actually cite every reference that backs these things from the point of research, it's going to take so much more than 50 minutes. But I'll just leave these things for you if you want further, explanation for them. The idea here is that several researchers selected this little book, this one book that says, usually learners build their language upon usage events. So when students build these things based on the material that you give to them directly, yes, right. But they also observe what you're doing, and they try to take usage events. What do you do in this event? What do you do in this event as a native speaker? And they try to imitate you. So that's what we're doing. Okay. Now, one of the problems, or one of the challenges with this first core, with this first principle, is that there is a lot of research that suggests L1 acquisition of our native languages, is different from L2 acquisition. Again, that's a very complicated issue, but actually this is kind of traditional look at things. This is the type of research that geared so much, education policy, whether United States or international, that L1 and L2 are different things. Okay, so we have to design learning materials in a very different manner. It's true to some extent, but there are so many things that are actually in common, that are shared. So in this approach, you try to actually focus on the things that are common. This approach tries to match L2 learning in a way that is very similar to L1 acquisition. Now, there are differences, like when we acquire our language, when we acquire English as a first language, we're acquiring everything at the same time. But our students come to college to study Arabic with a wealth of knowledge, wealth of culture. So how do you do these things? You're going to begin with ABC in Arabic, but they have this much knowledge. What do you do about it? Well, there are different ways of doing it. But the idea is that, again, this is in relation to another hypothesis or another finding, something people who are specialized in language know, the critical age hypothesis. You're familiar with this, right? The idea that after a certain age, there is a cut-off after which everybody is going to learn a language as a second language, not as like children learn languages as native. My son speaks English and Arabic almost seamlessly, no problem. But he always joke, that's my dad's English when I make a mistake, so many times. It is, again, there is much evidence to the critical age hypothesis, but it has been revisited several times. And the idea that the new development, that's not new, it goes back to 2003. This is a major research that came up around that time that says the idea is not that there is only that cut-off age. It used to be between 8 and 12, after which everybody's going to be second language learner. No, it's not that. This is one thing, age is one thing, but there are also other socioeconomic factors. There are other things. The background, the education, the motivation, the aptitude, all of these things can play. Now, the evidence that's there is that as you grow older, as people grow older, they tend to perform worse in language learning. So the earlier, the better. But the idea is not that there is this age, 12, and after that you're doomed. No. There are number of things. So this was a study that actually, it's huge. They took evidence from 2.3 million immigrant learners. And they found, that there are, the decline, the idea was that, in 12 and after there is a decline. This did not come out, all right? The decline was actually more associated with age and economic factors and social factors and education of the family and aptitude and all of these things. So again, this gives us language teachers opportunity to not give up on our students. We can raise their motivation. They're closer to getting to achieving their goals. Okay, all right. I'll pass. So the idea is, what are the challenges when you have to use only one language? Language one. You cannot translate. You cannot use English to help students. Help, quote unquote. Sometimes you ask them, what did you guys do last weekend? They want to tell you something that they feel passionate about. They cannot do it in Arabic. They want to do it in English. What do you do? They have to learn, and you have to learn as a teacher that work with what you know, because I'm interested in your product in Arabic. We'll talk about it after. Tell me your wonderful story after class. But in class, let's stick to the target language. Now, there's usually one time that you have to stop. I mean, when is it okay, acceptable to use L1, to use English? If communication breaks, if communication completely breaks, you're speaking in one place, students are so disconnected. Figure out a way to bring them back and go back to what you're doing. So this is one area where translation, drawing something, calling on a native speaker, doing something that helps to bring the class back together. So the goal is that you don't lose, sight of communication. Communication has to be there all the time. Okay? All right. So when I like this one, just focus. This is communication. Focus on the task, right? Focus on that task. If the idea of a given task is to talk about themselves and they made mistakes, it is not that we want to forget about mistakes. No, it's important. But the task is for them to communicate. They're communicating, take a note and leave that subject-verb agreement to some later time. That is the idea. Just prioritizing. See which is more important in the time of the task. Okay? This is number 2. The second core practice. Time. Okay. So the second one means you need to cater for different learning styles, right? So design different types of communication, interpersonal communication. For students, some students like to learn on their own. Others like to work one-on-one. Others like to work in a small group, in a larger group, etc. A good language teacher should be able to design different tasks that fit all of these different learning styles. Now, one thing I actually was listening to, I didn't have time to look for this study, but I was listening last week to NPR, and they talked about a group work. And there was this study, I think, coming out from Harvard that found that group work, we think that this is the best thing to do, right? Do group work. Everybody loves that. Students learn, peer learning, etc. Yeah, it's true. But again, we have to be very careful when we're designing our groups. The study, I can get you more information about it. I didn't have the time to go and figure it out. The study found something like when you design groups, you make sure that the challenge between the difference in level between students is kind of close. You don't put a student who's struggling so much in the beginning with somebody who's really high achieving, because what happens is that the high achieving student is going to feel so bored, and the one who's less achieving is going to feel hopeless, and it fails. So again, back to I+1. The levels, the groups have to be designed in a smart way, where the challenge or the difference between the levels is close, and give room for talk back and forth. So there are, of course, different things. Because there are different learning styles, you need to develop different tasks and different learning materials. So you have face-to-face communication, telephone conversations, messaging, writing, listening, different things. So one item, one level of content is presented in so many different ways. Okay? All right. One of the things that we find, because up until this level, we're focused on oral communication, right? So one of the things you will probably find, it's classic. You find, teacher comes in, he wants to break ice, work a little bit in the class, activate somebody. So they say, they do this thing, like, what time is it? The student, it's 8 o'clock. Excellent, thank you, done. This is, initiate, respond, evaluate, usually it does not stick with the students. Again, you can try something else. Initiate, respond, and follow up. Okay, so when a student gives you an answer, use that answer and follow up in the story. The idea is to create some kind of discourse, because if students link the learning material to some kind of discourse, to an event, something tangible, they're more likely to remember that. Okay? These are different things. Whispering is a good idea. I used to do it when I was doing so many things, and my mom always thought I was crazy. Talking about the task sometimes, talking about language, meta-language functions are also important. Why is it important to focus, at least in the first, let's say, 2 years, focus so much on oral skills? There is lots of research, this is just one sample, that says how much time we use in our oral communication, how much time in our daily life we use for just oral communication. 70% we're communicating. And by the way, this is based on English. Okay, I think Arabs do more oral than written communication. And of the 70% communication that is oral, listening takes 45%. Speaking, so look, together they take like three quarters of our activity. And then we express ourselves in writing or reading just by that much. So oral communications are really important. Okay. All right. This is one of, if we're going to focus on oral skills, then we need a way to evaluate oral skills, right? We find it always easy to evaluate something written, although sometimes it's actually haphazard most of the time. You know, you get a writing like exercise from students and you say 14 out of 20, 16 out of 20, but how is that? We don't know. We give sometimes just very general, you know, rubrics or recommendations. This is one good way of trying to evaluate students' oral skills, right? We use this, talk, okay? So while students are communicating, you know, we focus who's doing the talking and who's being accurate. Are you speaking up to the level, let's say you're talking to third-year students, supposed to be advanced, and they're communicating all the time, but at the level of beginner. That is not what we're looking for. And are they listening? Because again, you have to be a cooperative listening. We don't want one person to be taking over the whole scene. And then kind. Kind is being cooperative. Again, the whole idea of sympathetic interlocutor. This is a way to give value, give something tangible for our feedback when we talk about students' oral communication. Number 3 is to incorporate oral skills. So number 2, focused on oral skills. Number 3, core practice number 3, do the same thing for the 4 skills. So design lessons that have functional goals, right? So it's not only about, the idea is that language learning is not only about the form. Actually, the form comes at the end. It's about the content, about the communication, all right? Think about your goals. So I'll think about benchmarks. So that brings us to the idea of assessment. How much should we be obsessed with assessment? I'll talk about this briefly in a second, okay? And determine the ways to achieve them. I like this. Sure, you'd be familiar with this backward design. So before we begin a course, before we want to teach Arabic 101, okay? Before we go into the classroom, we need to think about what are our expected learning outcomes. What do we want to do? What do we want our students to achieve after the end of the semester? We decide these things first, right? And then we determine the acceptable evidence. What do we want to do? We want to test them. Do we want to ask them to give presentations, write portfolio? How are we going to get this? And then plan the learning, right? So this is backward design. I have seen actually all my life, most of my life, we've been teaching for 20 years. I've always done it the other way. I've always came in class, and by the time it's midterm, I'll just look at what we have studied in the class and write questions based on that, right? This is not right. This is not right. The best way to do, the better thing is that you need to plan this the other way around. You begin with the goals, and then you develop what your evidence so that your students know how they're going to achieve your goal, and then you design the experiment, the material that you're going to use. Okay? One thing that is very important is focusing on this, the idea, the big idea. And this has to do with, again, we're talking about the objectives, right? The learning objectives. The big idea has to do with the whole program. So I'm going to take like Arabic program as an example. What do we want the whole program to achieve as one unit, as one team? Okay, that's usually we express this in what we call mission and vision statements, right? When we plan, when we have to get money, when we have to continue living, we need to express what our mission is, what our vision is. This is it. This is the big idea. What do I want out of this program? When our students get 4th year, almost, about to graduate, what should they have achieved? This big idea, it has to be a unifier for the whole program team. Because without this, it's almost impossible for people to work efficiently. What happens is that you will probably have, 10 wonderful professors, excellent, unbelievable, but they're working in islands. Okay, everybody is not communicating. Having a team is really important, and it just helps you when you want to write the learning outcomes, because eventually everything has to feed up to this vision or the big idea. Okay, assessment. So what do? I am not a big fan of, I don't usually give these sweeping statements, but I'm not a huge fan, because I think that assessment has sometimes been it became almost corporate business thing. So I like assessment to be serving our goals, not that our program altogether, students, faculty, everybody serving the assessment. It's not the other way around, okay? I use assessment to serve my own goals, the goals that we have to serve, to see whether I'm able to get this big idea that I have for myself, okay? So usually, again, I usually recommend having some kind of external evaluation, because no matter how we try, we're going to be very subjective. We cannot avoid being subjective. And again, every campus has its own, criteria. But if you go for something that's nationally accepted, something like, TOEFL, like when you say, I was saying, talking to Ustaz Suad, like when somebody says, I got 500 in the TOEFL, I'm using the old system. Everybody knows what that means. You don't need to explain, right? So having some kind of national assessment for any language program is important, but don't overdo it. Like you can do it once a year, once every 2 years, depending on what your goals are. But having this is very important because it keeps feeding you where you're going. It tells you and your students whether you're doing good or not. What if your students move from this university to another university? Are they expected to be, do you foresee that they're going to be in a terrible situation, or going to be okay, or it's going to be not challenging for them? These things are very important. Okay. Now, one thing that we usually do is the formative assessment. It's our like daily, weekly, bi-weekly exams, quizzes, etc. But there is a bigger one, which is the learning outcome. Okay. Are we getting our learning outcomes? And I think this is better if you have the resources and the time and the manpower or the human power. This is usually done by somebody external, and it's usually good. The idea is to try to reflect on your own goals, see whether you're getting them or not. It's not to try to satisfy somebody. Now, if you have a grant, if you want to get money, that's one thing they look at. Okay, number 4. Core practice number 4, the grammar police. Now we're coming to this thing. Now we're coming to this zone, red zone. So this is one of the big issues. Arabic is not, it's not an exception. What do we do? Do we teach grammar? What do we do? Do we just give up on grammar? What do we do? Okay, so under this approach, grammar is very important, but we teach grammar for the functional goal, not for grammar itself. All right? So we teach grammar because we want students to use grammar. We don't care so much about them knowing the terminology. Now, this is hard to do, especially if you have a linguist teaching the course. I'm talking about myself. We find ourselves so sucked in the terminology, and we want our students to learn that. And I've seen this, actually. I've seen some very good school teacher teaching, 5th grade students Arabic grammar concepts. So when she comes in class, she says, today we're going to teach, let's say, relative clause. Everybody repeat, relative clause, relative clause. I felt so sorry for her first, and I felt so sorry for the students, because I asked her actually after that. I told her, oh, you do this usually? She said, yeah, of course. I said, okay, how do you feel after you finish 50 minutes of class? She said, I feel so tired, exhausted. Yes, of course. Now, what do you think your students feel? They're good. Okay, what about when you test them? They forget. Of course, that's what's going to happen, because they're repeating because they want you to feel happy.
The fatigue effect.
Right? They don't want problems with you. You're so passionate about this. They're going to satisfy you. But as soon as you turn on, they're going to forget, because this doesn't stick. They don't love it. Okay? At that time, if they're going to be linguists, they develop this at a very later stage. So, so avoid, I would say always, just forget about the form until students have mastered the function. And that is when you get back to the form. And this is one of the areas where L2 acquisition feeds into L2 learning. Okay? Everybody, our kids, everybody accepts that they acquire the grammar first. And when they go to school later on, we tell them this is subject, verb, object, agreement, etc., etc., etc. And you can't see this. You can see all of it. You can see this as a pattern, right? I like to give an example. My daughter, Nizar knows her, Kinda. We speak Arabic at home, English in school, so two systems, right? And sometimes, like 2 years ago, I was asking her, Baba, did you do this? She said, yes, in Arabic, she said, I katabted my homework. Katab, katab is the root for to write, the Arabic root for to write. She said, katabted my homework. So she got the ED, of course. She got the ED from English because that's what a past tense sounds like to her, right? And she got the root from Arabic because we always say, do your homework, uktub, etc. So now, what did I do? Did I, call the police?
No.
I don't want. No, I
I
said,
would say
excellent, love this. And my wife wants to correct her. No, just leave her. She will get it. She will get it. Now, is this a huge alarm when our students do this? Should I be alarmed? No. They will acquire grammar, and then if they decide to stick to the program, they will learn this. Okay? At one point, they will learn. So the idea is that mastery of grammar, like this way, the grammar targets, the grammar words, the terminology, this is not important. At least not in the early stage. We don't start by telling them the terminology and then they learn, because we all thought about this, right? How many times anyone of you in English classes, whatever, any classes, you go and the teacher writes, passive voice. You see this on the board, right? Passive voice. I mean, when I was learning English, that's what they did. Passive voice. And then they give you all of these made up sentences. And it takes you ages to figure this thing out because it's made up. It's made up. Memorize the chart, Memorize. It doesn't work. All right. So what do we need to avoid? I like this. I like number 2 so much. Just avoid this forced context. So I want to teach passive voice. I sit in my desk and I make 10 sentences in passive voice. Actually, if you give them to a native speaker, none of them sounds familiar. None of them is natural because they're forced. I created them because I wanted to teach a grammar target. Okay? And that is just not the way. It doesn't stick. Okay? Grammar is not an end, of course, we know this. And I said this, forget about form before students get meaning. Okay? All right, so what do? We don't want to be shackled with the grammar police. What do? Research finds that the best thing to learn, and again, this comes from first language acquisition, is that give extensive input in the first language. Give so much input, and this, again, goes back to the number 1, Arabic only all the time, 100% in the target language. What happens is that our minds are wired to learn the grammar. Okay? Automatically, we're going to learn the grammar if we have so much input. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that we're going to be saying so many things that students don't understand. And in this age, they don't feel comfortable if they don't understand everything, right? And they think, I'm not doing well. I have to listen to this full hour of Arabic when I just got 5%, right? It is so not comfortable, right? But again, I'll talk about what do you do with this. But this is how we learn language. This is how, when I'm speaking in my own language to my kids who are 2, 3, 4 years old, of course they don't understand everything. They get this little bit. And by time they get more, and then they communicate and they control everything in the language. So stick to, so much input in the language, so much input in the target language, and then students themselves on their own, they will figure out the grammar. If they decide to stick, they have the stamina to stay with you, they will come to you later on and tell you, okay, so why do we do this? Why do we do this? That's okay, that's good time, because they have developed the skill. They use the grammar now for function. It's okay to give them the terminology. Okay? One thing, this is when I talked about relative clause, passive voice, etc. So there is a curve, right? It's U-shaped. So in the beginning stage, you're giving the grammar. You're giving them, like foot, feet, repeat, foot, feet. Everybody repeats, right? So you feel at the end of the class, after 40 minutes, you feel, well, they mastered it. What is the plural of foot? Feet. Foot, feet. Perfect. Now, in a month, we want to test them. They lost that. So what happens that, they do this. They do feet, and then they figure out it's probably foot after they have listened so many times. Why? Because this is, this is exception of the rule. The rule says add s to make plural. So they have this from so much other evidence. They apply it, and then they figure out after some time that this is not right. So there is a huge difference between stage 1 and stage 3. Stage 1 is just repetition. Stage 3, I know this. Between them, you know, there is so much language input. There is a huge language input, and that's what you want. So the idea again, am I alarmed by foots? No. No. Students could be alarmed. You know, some evaluator would be alarmed, but I am not. Because, you know, you keep doing it, it comes out. Okay? Now, what are the problems? Okay? I want to focus on just this one. So what happens, what are the risks, so to speak, if you're giving so much content and students don't understand what's going on? All right? They probably will quit, and this happens. So one thing to do is to make sure that they're making gains. They need to be able to figure out gains. So they have this so much, you know, input in class. You want to make sure that across the learning process, every day, day by day, they're getting something more. And the best way to do this is to minimize the task. Just give small tasks. Small tasks can be learned fast, and students can figure out that they're doing some kind of gain. If they get gain, if they're you know, getting something, they will stick with it. Okay. One way one way of doing this. Yeah. Or you can go that way.
We have a class that just joined us. So
Welcome.
we're really happy
All right.
for our student participation.
We have seats right there.
Please come here, and there are chairs over there too.
Okay, so to maintain this environment and use of only target language, again, another challenge that we have is the challenge to, like the level of challenge to students. If we're going to be using only authentic language in first year, second year Arabic, that's going to be very challenging. So what do we do? One good way is to, again, follow this thing, pace. This is what it is. So there are stages of presenting a text. You bring, you know, authentic text in Arabic. You're not doctoring anything. You're not designing anything for the specific learning purposes you have in your mind. But you have this authentic text, which might be very challenging in certain areas. So you can use this thing. First level is presentation. Okay? Present the story. Present the tale, you know, whatever it is. And it has to have, you know, all of these natural things. It's a natural story, right? It's authentic. It's natural. It comes up from the language. It comes up from the culture. So it has all of the cultural elements in it. Okay, but some of them are not known to students. So what do? Get them to talk about it. You talk about it. Give little hints here and there. Okay, you know, use questions, pre-storytelling, you know, brainstorming, all of these things. The second stage would be attention. So you want to focus on the specific thing that you want. Let's say you want to teach simple past. Okay, you're not going to write 5 sentences in simple past. You will just get a long text that maybe has 2 or 3 examples in simple past. That's it, right? So the first thing is that you provide background about the whole text because you need the context in which the simple past is used. Step number 2, pay attention to that place, that little paragraph, 2 lines here, 2 lines there, that have good example of the simple past, your target, with enough context around it. All right? Step number 3, co-construction. Maybe I will ask students, okay, copy this, put that on the board or in your notebooks, rewrite that. Rewrite it. You can do it in different ways. You can rewrite, you can translate, you can get words that you know, whatever, anything. So you need students to, you know, come close to these 2 lines that have your target. Okay? And then extension. Again, we go back to this idea of IRE, IRF. You want to follow up, right? They would have learned that thing. Now you need to follow up. You need to extend this new concept so that it sticks. So the idea is that we take that concept in a larger context, and then we elaborate on this, and we extend the concept by hooking it up to other things that more details that become familiar to the student, right? The challenge would be sometimes, you know, when you work with authentic text, the challenge is always finding it suitable, like what is suitable. Some languages are very fortunate because they have databases like this. Arabic is not, unfortunately. There's just small number of databases. So a team can do this. You can use, there are 2 or 3 databases that are available. You can use them. But again, this is pretty much the goal, or the task of the team, the task of the professor and the team. Okay? So it needs time, it needs resources, but it can work. Usually the good thing about these things is that they take that time when you're doing them for the first time. And then after that, you just repeat the same material and enlarge and incorporate and customize. Okay? Are you still there? All right, number 5. Number 5. The use of authentic material. So it's design and carry out interactive reading, listening, comprehension using authentic cultural text. We've talked about this already, but the idea here is that we don't use material that we create, we make up to satisfy the forms that we're teaching, because this is doing it the other way around. Again, this is like telling my daughter, you know, okay, in simple past, use ED when she's only 3 years old. That just doesn't work. The best thing is that give the content, all right? And then after that, students learn these things on their own. Now, what is the big challenge? The big challenge, the big problem is that they're going to be reading all of these lines that they don't understand much. It is not a problem, because we focus here on task-based learning. You give them, again, and that's imitation to what happens in first language. You give a text, let's say video or whatever, or a text, 1 page, and you know that what they can't understand is maybe a number of words. Okay? So go to attention. Get them to focus on the words that you want them to know, and then study the context around that, and that's enough. So if a text has, let's say, it's a full page, my goal is in 2 or 3 lines. I use the full page just to provide the context, and I can help the students with that. I focus on the 3 lines because they are the target that I want them to learn. Now, in a month, I come back to the same text. They have the familiarity with the 2, 3 lines that they have discussed a month ago. So they like this. They feel secure. Now they learned more. You expand, or we expand the 3 lines to 5, to 6. All right, they learned more, right, from the same thing. And then leave it. It's still complicated. And you come back again, maybe you use the same text after 4 months, 5 months, when they have learned a lot more. So by end of the year, you probably use 1 text for 1 thing, or for 3, 4 different things. And it is good because it's recycling. It's recycling the same thing. The same thing happens every time we talk to our kids, every time we discuss anything with native speakers. We repeat ourselves so many, many, many times, and that's actually how things stick. So that's the idea. Okay? All right. You know, this is like how you deal with authentic material, right? Use interpretation, the interpretive model, right? You approach the text from all different ways. You read it from top to bottom. You go for 1 detail. You read in the middle, and then you go up, and etc. There are so many ways of handling the same text. Okay? We know these things. Just ways of handling this authentic text. I'm trying to get to the last one before time is over. All right? And there are here 3. This is in handling, you know, or dealing with authentic text. There are 4 ways. So we have 4 steps. We have preparation and comprehension. You prepare. Students, by the way, do the reading at home. They try everything. They prepare. They come to class with an idea of what we're going to talk about. And then you have interpersonal skills. So you have to ask students to talk to each other. You talk to them, etc. All types of group work and pair work and one-on-one, and you know, work with the tutor, work with the teacher. And then presentational. Presentational is tricky sometimes, because sometimes most of the time actually what we tend to do is, okay, who's going to volunteer, come here and talk. So you get somebody coming, dragging themselves, stand in front of the crowd, they do something mechanic, and they go and done. It's actually better to do it interpersonal, right? So when they come out, make sure that they're not doing, you know, 100% of that task. You know, it's much better to get 2 people to do it. You do it with that person, because if they're if a student is presenting something and they're not safe about what they're doing, then and they're doing 100%, this is so much strain. Okay, a better way of doing it is divide up the tasks, small tasks, right? They get out, and then you help from where you are, or another student helps. You relieve some of the stress, right? Okay. And then finally, extension. Extension always, always take what does this text tell us? What did we learn? So extend the knowledge. That's very important. Okay, the last one is this, is appropriate feedback. Okay, and so how do we provide feedback? Okay, the most common one is corrective feedback, right? So my kids did, he go to school. You say, oh, he goes to school. The teacher comes in immediately. He wants to help, right? He goes to school, right? There has been lots of research on this thing. What is the best way of giving feedback to students, all right? One of them is, recast. So you say the student says something with an error or a mistake. You repeat, taking out the error, right? Clarification. You ask students to clarify. Metalinguistic feedback. You tell them, what is this? What is, like, if it's a cognate, what is the word for that in English? It helps them remember, etc. Elicitation. You just keep pushing them to figure out the good thing. And repeat. Teacher repeats and changes the correct, the error or the mistake. Okay, so based on some research, the goal of corrective feedback is to get students to what we call the uptake. The uptake is pretty much students taking control of their own errors and trying to figure them out. Now, the best and most efficient way is elicitation. And there have been research on this that found out that students who were forced to do elicitation maintained or were able to get uptake at 100%. What does that mean? That means they made the error one time or two times, and then you force them in a way to get the correct answer. Because the effort they put on this, it sticks, okay? It sticks to them. They don't forget that. But recast, again, recast is me, the teacher, trying to be helpful, trying to be sympathetic, okay? If you use recast, the research finds that uptake is done only at 31%. There's no comparison. So while it looks that you're torturing the student by getting them to figure out the right thing and not giving them help, or direct help, so to speak, you're actually helping them. You're really helping them. And when you're trying to help them by giving them, something packed, ready, this is the answer, that isn't going to stick with them, okay? I'm not going to go through, trying to stick to my time. Okay. All right. Okay, of course, we talked about the importance of focusing on the content and then the form. Communication comes before the way you communicate or the form of communication. And yeah, one last thing that has to do with this is going to be real fast. Heritage speakers, what do we do with them, right? Well, there are so many things, right? Usually, based on so much research, heritage speakers perform well in oral skills, right? But their written skills, reading and writing, lag behind.
They're good in listening too.
That is one thing. Now, the other thing is that, again, based on if we have heritage speakers, no offense, they usually think much better of themselves than what they really are. So when you test them, I'm talking about. I said I'm sorry. So based on impression, they're actually good at presenting themselves. But when you test them based on standardized, testing, they don't perform where they think they should be performing. So we can be also, as teachers, confused as to their mastery of oral skills. We think that they're doing well, but the idea is that they hear all of these words that belong to superior level, let's say, and they put them in intermediate structures. So when you put the two things together, they just sound so odd. They write structures that are sometimes very elementary, let's say, with complex words. So you give the impression, and they have the impression that they're doing very well, when actually they're not. So what you need to do is that we need to work on all of these skills together. Focus more on the written skills, and also make sure that listening and speaking are kind of in the same lines. And the other thing is that we need to activate their passive knowledge. Heritage speakers have so much passive knowledge that is stored there, but they don't use it because they don't need it. So you need to push them again to get this out. One of the problems that come in a class is that the class turns out to be very not homogeneous, right? Because of the different levels in the class. So one good way of doing this is to actually have a contract with the native speaker, the heritage speaker, you know? You're going to help me. That's what we're going to do. But if you leave them on their own, it's not going to work. But just use them. Use these guys to provide the other students with more knowledge about the language. Okay? And, you know, that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I think 2 minutes over time. Thank you.